Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. I desperately tried to get my lips to match the tie-dye splotches or bleached eye splotches on my black dress. It took 3 different lipsticks and I don't really think I got it, but this is as close as it's gonna get. I used orange and brown and yellow, so I tried. But you don't care about lipstick, you're here to learn about tiger salamanders. And I have all that right here. So this tiger salamander care guide is going to be one of the first of many in which I talk about animal care at an extensive length, and I think I'm going to be titling them like all you need to know about tiger salamander or whatever species, because oh my god, did I go in. So all these pages right here, all of them, that is what I have to tell you today. So a couple disclaimers. I'm going to be leaving timestamps down below for every different subsection that I cover. Subsections include where to get one, lifespan in captivity, general temperament, enclosure size, all that stuff. I'm going to break it down by section, and then if you only want to learn about certain things, you can go to the description and just click on that timestamp and it will take you right to that section of the video. I also urge you to check down there before you ask any questions, because if you ask a question that I've already answered in the video, I'm not going to respond to it. Now, if you ask a question and I could delve further, I'll answer it. But if I already answered it, I'm not gonna go in the comments and answer it again. So make sure you pay attention, listen carefully, and use the description to your advantage. I will not ever cover a species in terms of their care that I have kept for less than a year, and I have had Neville since 2018, so that'd be over a year now. Neville is my tiger salamander, and I got her in August of 2018, so I've had her for almost 2 years. As I say in every care video, I can only share my own experiences and my own knowledge. That's never going to be a one-stop. Like, technically you could watch my video and get a tiger salamander and be fine, but I urge you to find other resources, because what works for me might not work for you or your tiger salamander. And it's always good to hear from different people and see different resources. So don't just watch videos, for example, read forums and things like that. So just make sure that you are being comprehensive with your research and that you're not just looking at one thing. I'm not perfect, I'm only human. If there's anything that I miss, I will leave it in the description of this video. I doubt there's something that I missed, but it's very possible, and if I learn anything new, I'll add that in the description as well. And as I say with every care guide, please make sure that you have an exotic vet, okay? Anytime you get an exotic pet, you're going to want to have a vet that specializes in exotics. Trust me, they are a source. There's just like such comfort to know that there's something there, someone there to help you when you need it. And lastly, make sure that they are legal to own in your area. They may not be. So let's go ahead and get started with everything you need to know about tiger salamanders. As I will start every care guide with the Latin name of the species, I will include it right here. Country of origin is North America, and they're pretty widespread in North America, but you'll find them most commonly between New York and Florida. Their natural habitat in the United States, or in North America in general, would be in underground burrows. They live in the dirt most of the time, and I've seen a lot of people keep tiger salamanders as more of an aquatic species. It's true that they do go in water and that they do need water, which we'll get to later, but they tend to live in dirt and only go to water when it comes time to breed. They can be found as deep as 4 feet in the ground, which is insane. That's like as deep as they'll go. Normally they're not that deep, and you can find them anywhere near woodlands, grasslands. Like, they just live all over the place. They're a pretty hardy amphibian, so you can find them in a lot of different biomes. Their lifespan in captivity is 20 plus years. Typically they're wild caught, so you don't know how old they are when you get them, but they will live quite some time in captivity. So what do they look like? They can range from a number of colors. Some of them are like really dark, almost black. Some of them are brown, and they'll have bandings on their body that can range from like a bronze color to a green color to a brown color to even gold or yellow. It can be any variation too. It can be like a mustard yellow, it can be a brownish yellow, like it depends. They all look different. They should have, if they're healthy, thick bodies and stout, strong legs. They're actually called mole salamanders, which means that they burrow in the ground, and their legs are very strong for this. They're made for digging, and you can tell, like, they just have thick legs and wide feet. They can range between 8 to 14 inches in length, and their tail is going to take up a good portion of this. Now, if you have one in captivity and you're trying to determine its sex, good luck. This can be a little bit of a challenge. Males tend to have a bulge at the base of their tail, near their cloaca, and they also tend to have thicker legs. Males also tend to have longer tails, and some males during breeding season will have like a flattening of their tail. However, if you don't have two tiger salamanders to compare, it can be difficult to sex your tiger salamander. They don't readily breed in captivity, so even if you had a male and a female housed together, it would be hard to tell which one's which if they don't have obvious markings like a thicker tail or bulge. So I wouldn't be too pressed about trying to figure out what yours is. If you want to know where to get a tiger salamander, this can be a little bit of a challenge because, like I said, they don't breed readily in captivity, so you're not going to find one from like a captive breeder in the United States. However, most tiger salamanders in captivity are wild caught. So if you do find a breeder who sells other like newts, amphibians, whatnot, and they have tiger salamanders, it's not because they bred them, it's because they have a stock of wild caught ones that they're selling. When a tiger salamander is brought in from the wild, it can't be re-released even if you live in the United States, and even if you are in the area in which they would live. And also, please don't take one from the wild as a pet. Not something that you should do. Wild animals are meant to stay wild, and animals that are already in captivity or are captive bred need to stay in captivity. It's just like a line that has to be drawn. So if you really want a tiger salamander, I recommend looking on Craigslist because there will often be tiger salamanders for rehoming through Craigslist. You can also check cowdata.org. It is basically a forum for people who have amphibians or people who like amphibians, all different kinds, axolotls, frogs, newts, all kinds of salamanders. So if you are interested in getting a tiger salamander or learning more about them, that is a really good resource. They have a forum where you can find ones for rehoming, and that's actually how I found Neville. Keep in mind, if you Google like where to get a tiger salamander and it brings up an online website from like basically a chain pet store but online, or like a mass breeder for other species that happens to have tiger salamanders, like I said, it's going to be wild caught, and I would urge that you consider where you put your dollar to get them, because you might end up with one that's unhealthy, or one that was recently wild caught, or one that's really young. If you find someone who has it already, like as a situation of rehoming, you're capable of asking them a bunch of questions, and when it comes to like an online supplier, that might not be the case. They might not be able to answer any questions for you about that animal. Now let's talk about the cost. Tiger salamanders are not expensive. I think the most you'll pay for them is really to have them shipped to you if you lived in an area where you couldn't find one. Their initial setup is not expensive, their long-term care is not expensive. They are a relatively inexpensive pet. Now keep in mind, every exotic pet that you have is going to have vet care costs that come into consideration, so please keep that in mind. Okay, so now we're on to behavior. This is probably my favorite thing about tiger salamanders because Neville is just an absolute ham. Like, she is so funny, she is energetic, she just likes being around me, but you're not always going to find that. So typically tiger salamanders are jovial little food hungry creatures, but you're also going to get some that are more reclusive, and also it depends on the time of year, but we'll get to that in a minute. But if you're interested in getting one that has like a more jovial personality, being able to talk to the person who had them before will give you some insight into what the behavior or temperament of the one you're getting is like. If you get from an online supplier, that might not be the case. So it's just something to keep in mind. But regardless of what the temperament of your tiger salamander is, they all respond really well to tongue feeding or hand feeding. So if you want yours to really associate you with good things, give them the food from your fingers, because they will thank you, and then you'll get to see them more often, and it's nice. Oh, one more thing I want to add is that they are not aggressive. If you ever get bit by a tiger salamander, it's because they think that you're food, and they don't really have anything that can harm you. Like, I've been bit by Neville before on the tip of my finger, and it doesn't really feel like anything. Maybe like a little bit rough, like the inside of their mouth is a little rough, but that's it. It doesn't hurt, and it won't hurt you, and it won't hurt them, as long as you don't freak out and flail about. Just leave your finger there and they'll let go eventually, and you can maybe slowly pull your finger out of their mouth if that's the case. They will not bite you, they're not territorial, there's no reaction like that from them. Now, some tiger salamanders can be a bit lungy, so like one of the behaviors that you'll see them regularly do is like lunge for food. Stop
lunging at the top of the enclosure.
You may also see them dig. Obviously they're a mole salamander, like I said, so digging is very natural for them. You may also see them shed, and they like kind of slither out of it, but we'll talk about shed a bit later. You'll also see them soak in water, and you'll probably see them sleep, but a lot of times they'll be sleeping under the dirt. So, but yeah, generally very calm behaviors from them. There's not a lot of behaviors that would be like territorial, aggressive. They just really eat and sleep and shed and poop and hang out in water. Like, they're pretty simple. Okay, let's talk about handling. Handling amphibians is not something that I recommend doing, especially if it's frequent. I really would only recommend handling your amphibian for like a health check, maybe once a week or less. It's not really necessary. Like, they don't really get enjoyment out of being held, and really it's only to serve you because you enjoy holding them. If you want a pet that you can hold a lot, I don't recommend a tiger salamander. If you want a pet that you can interact with, you know, like through the glass, or if you want a pet that you can watch, that's the tiger salamander. Now, when you do need to hold them, you need to have freshly washed hands, and you need to use a soap that has like no perfumey, strong detergents, parabens, things like that. You rinse your hands thoroughly and then dry them, and then I rinse my hands again just to get any fuzzies off from the towel. You can hold your tiger salamander with moistened hands because like the dryness of your skin could like irritate their skin. So the reason you want to go through all of this before you hold your tiger salamander is because their skin is really permeable and they use their skin to breathe. So if there's any toxins on your hand that's going to harm their skin, it's also going to harm their ability to breathe. So it's really dangerous. You want to make sure that you wash your hands thoroughly. You can also just hold them using gloves. You'll want to use neoprene gloves. You do not want to use cloth gloves. And sometimes the gloves that you put on that are like plasticky, rubbery material, sometimes they have like powdered dust on them so that like they don't stick together. Do not use these. I only use like my bare hands washed and then water, but if you want to use gloves, there's like a box of blue neoprene gloves. They work perfect for holding amphibians. Do not use cloth gloves. Don't use any gloves that have any like material that's absorbent. Again, that's going to dry out your amphibian skin. And if you do decide to handle your amphibian, please keep it to a minimum. It stresses them out. Like, it's really not necessary and it's dangerous for them. So try to keep it at a minimum. If you are going to take your amphibian out of the enclosure, which I don't recommend by the way, but if you're going to do it, make sure that you don't put them on like a cloth, like not a blanket, not a towel, anything like that. Don't put them on something that's going to cause them harm. So if you can't use cloth gloves, for example, you can't set your tiger salamander on a blanket or a towel. If you can't use gloves that have like a powder on them, you can't put them on a surface like where your makeup has been. Just try to be really mindful about their skin because that's how they breathe. And it's also, their skin is really delicate. It's like rubbery, so it can tear easily. It can scratch easily. So now let's talk about tiger salamanders and when they are active. So tiger salamanders tend to be more active. This is a challenge because my tiger salamander wakes up anytime I walk by her enclosure. She has a tendency to sleep during the day and wake up more towards like dusk, and then she's awake throughout the night and she's asleep again before morning. So they're nocturnal. However, if I were to feed Neville during the day, she'd probably be awake for a good portion of the day because she wants me to feed her. Or like if I'm putting laundry away, Neville will wake up and come out of her house and just beg for food. She'll just beg for it. So it's really going to be dependent on your lifestyle. However, naturally they are nocturnal. So now let's talk about the activity during the year for a tiger salamander. So tiger salamanders, like other amphibians and reptiles, will brumate. So brumation is basically hibernation for them, and they'll brumate during the cold months, and it's just a way of preserving energy when food is scarce. It's like I said, just like hibernation, except some reptiles do, some reptiles don't, and I think the same can be said for tiger salamanders. Some will and some won't. Neville did the first year longer than she did this year. Her brumation was very short, only a couple weeks, but the year before it was probably a month or so. But I know some people whose tiger salamanders brumate for months, and that's okay. Every tiger salamander is going to be different, especially since every person's temperature, like in their home, is going to be different. One mistake that a lot of like reptile and amphibian keepers can make, especially if they're new, can be to fret, to panic when their animal stops eating and starts brumating. Now, 99 times out of 100, there's no reason to panic, and this is just what their bodies are meant to do. This is what their instincts tell them to do, so you don't have to panic. If there's other health signs that are concerning you, go to your exotic vet. If not, leave your animal alone to brumate. It's okay for them, it's good for them, they will be fine. They're not going to starve themselves to the point of dying. Like, it's gonna be okay. I know it can be stressful, but you just have to let them do their thing. Spring is usually breeding season for tiger salamanders. However, tiger salamanders don't readily breed in captivity, so it's not something you have to worry about, especially if you're housing yours alone, which we'll get to. Sorry I keep saying we'll get to it, but we will. Okay, and now we are on to habitat. So first we're going to start with the habitat size and the shape of the habitat that I recommend. So for the size, I recommend no smaller than 20 gallons. In fact, a 20-gallon long is preferred simply because it's more terrestrial and tiger salamanders do not climb. However, if you have a 20 long that you want to use, make sure you fill that bad boy with substrate so that they can use all of that space properly. One thing that I always recommend to amphibian and reptile keepers is a front opening enclosure. In fact, for any animal that's a prey animal, get a front opening. Actually, for any animal ever, get a front opening enclosure. They can see you coming, so they're not going to feel threatened. They're not going to feel like they are being predated on. Like when you come from above, it's going to trigger them, like they think something's coming to get them. So it's also not a good way to bond with them if they can't see you, if they can't interact with you. Also, it makes feeding a lot easier if you can reach into the enclosure this way instead of from above. So I always recommend a front opening enclosure, and boy do I ever recommend that with a tiger salamander, because it makes interacting with Neville a blast, and she is hilarious. I love her drama. Like, she's amazing. So I recommend a front opening enclosure to better facilitate a relationship with your animal, and also just to make things easier for you when it comes to feeding and maintaining the enclosure. Now keep in mind, when you choose a front opening enclosure for a tiger salamander, you're going to want doors that are pretty high up so that you can have plenty of substrate beneath where the door opening is. When it comes to enrichment, it's pretty simple with a tiger salamander, but I often feel like, as is the case with a lot of like burrowing type of animals, they won't put enough enrichment on the top. Like, they'll just leave it substrate, a cave, a bowl, and that's it. And I genuinely don't think that's enough, because I have seen Neville interact more with her enclosure when I have other stuff in it that might not have been normally put in a tiger salamander enclosure. So for Neville's enrichment, I give her a cork round hide that's like partially buried in the substrate. She has a cork round planter that has a live marble queen pothos, and then she also has a DIY background that's textured. She also has her like little spring area, which has like rocks, and it's filtered water, and it's quite sizable compared to a lot of like the bowls you'll see people keep with tiger salamanders. And you can also use like driftwood, you can also use like really anything. You can use a resin hide if you want. There's nothing wrong with resin hides. A lot of times I see people just not using as much as they could to make the enclosure as nice as it could be, to offer as much enrichment as possible. Make sure anything you have in the enclosure is not sharp, like no sharp edges, nothing that's not secure that could fall over on them. If you have driftwood, sand down the edges. If you're using cork, make sure there's no sharp edges. If you're using resin, oh my god, resin always has sharp edges, so make sure you sand those down. Make sure that there's nothing really heavy that, like, if it fell over in the enclosure, it could kill your tiger salamander. Keep in mind, they burrow under the substrate, so the surface of the substrate is going to move, and if something falls over and crushes them, that'd be really unfortunate. So just make sure things are secure, or that if they aren't secure, they're light enough to not cause any harm. Like cork is really lightweight, and like thin pieces of driftwood can be really lightweight too, so just keep that in mind. Okay, now we're on to substrate. It is an absolute must for this species to have substrate. You cannot get around not offering substrate. They absolutely need it. They are, like I said, mole salamanders, which means they burrow in the dirt. Moreover, you can't get away with just offering 1 or 2 or 3 inches. You need to have multiple inches, enough for them to get their whole bodies under and then some. So I recommend 6 to 8 inches of substrate throughout. And if you want to build more than that, again, you have like a front opening enclosure, you can always build up more substrate to the back. So it's always good to offer as much substrate as you possibly can. Now let's talk about what kind of substrate you should offer. You want to avoid sand outright. Sand is pretty abrasive, and because their skin is so soft and sensitive, you want to avoid any abrasive substrates. So any like really small gravels, again, that's an impaction issue all on its own, but small gravel, any crushed walnut shell, which I don't know why you'd use that. Aspen would not work either because it doesn't hold humidity and it's not a soil. So just keep in mind that you want to use a soil and not anything outside of that. No large wood chunks, no bark, things like that. I often see EcoEarth recommended, and I have some stuff to say about EcoEarth. So if you use just EcoEarth, it's often problematic because EcoEarth is not really a soil. It is coconut fiber, like it's little fibers from coconuts. It's not soil. So on its own, it gets the trash rating from me. I hate it. So at first I only used EcoEarth. The entire like 5 inches of substrate was all EcoEarth, nothing else. And after a little bit, even though I was changing it out regularly and cleaning it, it got nasty, I guess, because it never smelled bad or anything, it never looked bad, but it caused a bacterial infection on Neville, which is treated and is fine and everything. But as soon as I realized that it's a common problem with EcoEarth to be doing this, along with a lot of other problems that EcoEarth has, I immediately went on the hunt for a better substrate option. So I went with organic topsoil, which was indicated as being safe on caldata.org that I mentioned earlier. Now, when you use organic topsoil, like a lot of times it's like from a hardware store, so you have to go through the process of like treating it. So first you have to bake it in the oven for like hours, and then once it's all dried out and anything that was alive in it is dead, then you have to sift it to get out any chunks, any weird things that don't belong in soil, and then it's finally safe for your tiger salamander. And I use a blend of EcoEarth and organic topsoil, and I also tried out the BioDude's Terra Firma. I wasn't a huge fan of it. There's a lot of wood chunks in it, so I had to sift all those out. And there was even like some tiny bits of sand in it, so it's not really my favorite, and I wouldn't recommend it for a tiger salamander. But there is some of that in my tank just because I had it, so I figured I'll mix it in. Also, the Terra Firma gave me wood mites, which had me freaking out the day that I first added the substrate. And then fortunately my friend was like, no, they're wood mites, they're safe. And I was like, thank God. And the substrate that I use is also bioactive, which means that it has isopods and springtails. Whatever dirt that you decide to use absolutely must be free of pesticides and any other type of chemical. It has to just literally be dirt. If you're going the route of it not being bioactive, no matter what substrate you use, you're gonna have to change it out depending on how much you use every couple of months or more frequently. So if you have a larger amount of substrate, you won't have to change it as frequently because you're offering more of it. If you have a lesser amount of substrate, you'll have to clean it more often. Even if you use a bioactive substrate, it's not just like suddenly this dirt is safe forever. You will have to change it out. Not as frequently as every couple of months. Oh, and I forgot to mention, the species of isopod that I use are dwarf white tropical isopods. They're super tiny, so I have no fear that Neville will try to like eat them in the substrate because she's never even seen them. And then the springtails, really I don't ever see them because they just hang out where the substrate is moist, which is at the very bottom. But springtails and isopods eat waste, so any sort of poop, any mold, anything like that, they will consume it and keep the enclosure fresh. Another thing that I do in my enclosure to provide enrichment and to provide a safe place for the isopods in case they are on the surface, which is pretty much never, is leaf litter. So leaf litter is great for enrichment, and it's also great for adding food for the isopods and also a place for them to hide. Also, it just looks nice. I think it looks nice. If you don't want to use leaf litter, you can use cork. Like if you have small pieces of cork, the isopods will live on the underside of it, and oftentimes you'll find springtails there too. Now let's talk about the moisture of the substrate. So it cannot be dry. You do not just want like dry soil in there. You want to have soil that is partially moist. You also don't want like water sogged soil either. When you squeeze it, it should not be dripping out water. It should be moist enough that it's like crumbly and kind of holds together, but not like so dry that it falls through your fingers, and not so wet that it's just like a caked mud pile in your hand. So if it's too wet, you will cause skin issues like a bacterial infection, or it could be too much water retention. If it's too dry, they can have issues breathing and shedding. So you want to attain a proper humidity in the substrate. Humidity above the substrate, it doesn't really matter. A normal household humidity above the substrate is fine. And when you spray down the enclosure to offer humidity to the substrate, I generally like to pour some into the substrate so it actually gets straight down to the bottom instead of just misting the surface, which often dries out much quicker and doesn't actually moisten the bottom layers of the substrate. I'd also like to add, this is not a species you'd want to use a drainage layer with, because it's the same reason you don't want to use any substrate that has like large chunks, and that's because it's abrasive for their skin and can stop them from actually having proper burrows. You just want a nice fine soil. You don't want something that's chunky or hard and a drainage layer is hard, and also it would prevent them from using all the space that they possibly could to burrow. Plus, because they don't have like a super humid substrate, the drainage layer is really pointless. So while we're talking about humidity of the substrate, it's really important to also have a place where the tiger salamander can go to completely submerge their body. This would be the form of a bowl or a large container, or even like a small water section of the enclosure. Now this should not take up like a huge amount of the enclosure. Tiger salamanders, like I said, are mole salamanders. They like to burrow. They are not aquatic. They're not even really semi-aquatic because they're in the ground most of the time. But Neville does once a day come out from her hide and chill in her jacuzzi. She'll fall asleep in there sometimes too. It's very funny. She'll come out and go back to her house, and that's that. So every tiger salamander is going to be different. Some are going to use the water more than others, but regardless, you have to have a source of water. It can be room temperature. It has to be dechlorinated. I read that distilled water can cause electrolyte imbalances, so don't use distilled, and make sure that you are changing the water daily. If you use a filter to keep the water clean, you can go 1 to 3 days without changing it, but it still needs to be changed frequently because the water will be absorbed into their skin, and if it is toxic, it'll make them sick. Or if they've pooped in it, that's not really a good environment to live in, your own feces water. So they do tend to poop in their water. Sometimes Neville will shed in her water, and just yesterday left a big floating blob of skin, which was disgusting but also fascinating. And she also leaves poop sausages in there, which we'll talk about their poop and their shed in a little bit. But just make sure that you are offering clean water. If you, like I said, want to use a filter, we'll get to that in a minute, but make sure no matter what, you are changing out that water and offering fresh water. Fresh, dechlorinated, not distilled, room temperature water. So the water section that you have, whether it be like an actual section of the enclosure or a bowl, it cannot be deep. They are not strong swimmers and they will drown. Offer them something to like sit on in the water if you want to offer a bit more. So like for example, my water section has rocks on the bottom, so it has more height, and then I can add more water. But just make sure that it's not so high that they can drown, and also that it's still enough water that they can submerge themselves if they want. Like their full body should be able to be submerged, but not enough that they couldn't stand on their feet and get out if they want to. If you go the route of using a filter in the enclosure, or in the water section I mean, make sure it doesn't have a strong current. You don't want them to be like beaten by the waves of this filter. You just want something that's going to create some filtration as well as some movement on the water's surface. They will use this water to soak in, but you will never see them actively drink it because they don't actively drink water. The way that they get hydrated is from their food and from soaking up water in their water section. Like their skin stays hydrated that way. So you will never see them drink water. So don't be alarmed if you don't see it. Tiger salamanders can tolerate a wide range of temperatures, but do best when kept below 80. So don't offer heat to them. Your household temperature is probably just fine for them. If your temperatures in your house are below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you might see that your tiger salamander is inactive. This might cause them to brumate a lot, so I would recommend keeping them in an area of the house that is always between 60 and 80 degrees, regardless the time of the year. So I feel like for most people that's pretty achievable, but I just wanted to clarify. When it comes to lighting, the only reason to use a light is to provide a day and night cycle. If you have a well-lit bedroom, then there's really no need to offer light. If you have live plants, however, you will want to offer light so that the plants can grow. You do not want to offer any light that puts out heat, and when it comes to UVB, you don't need to offer it. They're typically nocturnal and typically always burrowed in the ground. If you still wanted to offer it, you definitely can. I can't offer any advice on that because I don't keep UVB on my tiger salamander. I'm sure someone out there does, so just do a lot of research on how the supplementation of the food would change for your tiger salamander if you offer UVB. Also, there's no reason to offer colored bulbs. When it comes to cohabitation, I really don't recommend cohabbing. There is no benefit to cohabbing. In the wild, they live on their own, and then they only come together to breed. So they don't live in groups, they don't live in mated pairs, they're not like that. If you have two housed together, they'll probably just tolerate each other, and you may occasionally see one lunge after the other one because they think it's food. So really, I don't think it's necessary. You're gonna do what you want at the end of the day, but that's just my opinion. It doesn't have any benefits, and I really don't see the point. Oh, and please do not house them with other species. And if you have one and you're adding another one to the enclosure, please get a bigger enclosure and quarantine the new animal so you can make sure they're not going to spread something to your tiger salamander. Also, it's probably a good idea to have them be around the same size so that one doesn't try to consume the other one. When it comes to nutrition, this can be said for every species that you'll keep. Variety is best. A varied diet is best. You want to offer numerous types of food. That way they get benefits from all the different types of food. Not only do they get like health benefits from the different types of food that you're offering, but it's also more enriching to offer different types of food. So what kind of food can you offer? Let's get to it. So tiger salamanders are insectivores and as such eat insects, as you could probably assume. So they can eat dubia roaches, they can eat earthworms, they can eat crickets, they can eat waxworms and hornworms, but you'll want to offer those on occasion because waxworms are fatty and hornworms are just really have a lot of moisture and calcium. I've seen people offer them mealworms, I've seen people offer them superworms, I've seen people offer them locusts and grasshoppers. They eat all kinds of stuff. And they'll eat anything you put in front of them. So make sure that it is the appropriate size, which means no larger than the space between their eyes, which is just an indication of how wide their throat is. And they'll try to eat something bigger, so just be careful about that. Adult tiger salamanders can eat 2 to 3 times a week. You want to be careful about overfeeding them or feeding them too many fatty foods because they have a tendency toward obesity, which is why I didn't even recommend pinky mice on here. Some people feed pinky mice to their tiger salamander. I completely disagree with that because they're so fatty. So let's stick to insects for these guys, okay? No matter what insects you're offering, you want to make sure that they are gut loaded. And gut loading is the process by which you feed healthy foods to the insects that are going to be fed to your pets. So I'll just go down the list of what I feed my dubia roaches, for example. My dubia roaches are fed daily with a lot of vegetables. So they'll have squash, or they'll have zucchini, or they'll have carrots, or they'll have the stems of leafy greens. Like I feed my bearded dragons leafy greens, and then the stems obviously they can't eat because they're super hard, so I just give them to the insects. They eat broccoli, they can eat oranges, they can eat apples, they can eat really anything that's gonna be like nutritious. A lot of people have a tendency to feed like fish flakes or dog food or meat to their insects, and that's not good because too much protein can cause gout in your animals. So you really don't want excess protein. What you really want to make sure you're getting is calcium and vitamins, which can be found in fruits and vegetables. The insects should be gut loaded with a healthy fruit or vegetable or both. And then that's 24 hours before you offer them as feeder insects. And then you offer them, and then when your tiger salamander eats them, they're getting all of the beneficial nutrients from the food and also from the insect. So they are getting a healthy diet. So I want to explain how I feed Neville just so that it's clear. I will take the insect and I'll keep them in like a little bowl and set them above her enclosure because she tries to jump out of her enclosure the moment I open the doors, so I have to be ready. So I will take some bamboo tongs and I'll grab one insect at a time and I will hold them in front of her face until she opens her mouth and basically just sucks them in. I usually offer her, depending on the size, 1 to 3 insects a night. If they are like some smaller dubia, I'll offer her 3. If they're like more medium-sized dubia, I'll just offer her 1 or 2. So really it's just going to depend on the size of the insect that you're offering and the frequency at which you're offering food. Please do not offer insects that you found outside. They can contain parasites. They're not gut loaded. I mean, it's a bad idea. It's a bad idea. Do not offer insects you caught from the outside to feed to your captive, your inside pet. Tiger salamanders should and typically will always eat, so if yours isn't eating and it's also not broodmating, I would contact your exotic vet because it's pretty rare for them to turn down food. Now we're going to talk about supplementation, and that is basically just a supplement that is typically in a powder form, and you dust it onto the insect that you're offering to your tiger salamander. Now, because tiger salamanders are nocturnal, a lot of times you don't need to keep them with UVB like I said, but you can offer calcium and still should offer calcium through the form of a calcium supplement. So I keep calcium carbonate, and I also keep calcium plus D3 and multivitamin on hand so that I can rotate between them and offer Neville calcium on some food and then calcium with D3 on other foods. Every feeder insect that you offer should be dusted in a rotational schedule, with the exception of earthworms, which are really calcium rich and don't need a supplement, and hornworms, which are really calcium rich and don't need a supplement. It's important to provide calcium and calcium plus D3 to your tiger salamander because not offering these supplements to your tiger salamander can result in metabolic bone disease. It's pretty rare that I've seen this in a tiger salamander. However, it's obviously much more common in reptiles, but MBD can still occur, and so can a whole host of other issues by not offering enough calcium, so just make sure that you're doing your proper supplementation. So just to reiterate, calcium carbonate is pure calcium. There is no other vitamins or D3 or anything in it. And then you can also find calcium with D3, and you can find calcium with D3 and a multivitamin, and you can find just a plain multivitamin. I wasn't overly thrilled with how I addressed supplementation when I first filmed this, so here I am coming from a voiceover. I originally just discussed what my supplementation methods were, but again, that doesn't really work for everyone because everyone's going to have different husbandry, so I figured I should just make a couple notes in addition to that. So basically, if you offer a diet to your tiger salamander that has more calcium-rich foods, so for example, hornworms and earthworms are higher in calcium than dubia roaches and crickets. So if you offer those predominantly, or even if you just offer a mostly predominant diet of earthworms, the amount of calcium that you're going to need to offer is going to be different than someone who offers crickets and dubia roaches, for example. So because the diet that I offer is mostly dubia roaches with occasional treats of earthworms, waxworms, and hornworms, then what I offer is I offer calcium once a week. Now, if you're offering, again, like I said, more earthworms or more hornworms, you're not going to have to offer calcium as much. With that said, if you have UVB, that could also make a complication to what supplementation is going to look like for you. Again, please do research on that because I don't offer UVB, so I'm not sure how supplementation would change for you. Now, when it comes to a multivitamin, that's going to be a little bit more challenging because I've actually been doing some research about vitamin A, and that's been a whole interesting thing. So basically, multivitamin for a tiger salamander, you're only going to want to offer once every couple weeks. And the reason for that is, and this, I guess the same could be said for their lack of needing as much calcium as you might think, they are a nocturnal salamander. They live under the dirt a lot of times. So anything that they get nutritionally usually comes from their food, or if they ingest substrate, which, by the way, a lot of substrate is rich in minerals. Keep in mind they're also going to be getting vitamins and calcium from their food if they're being properly gut loaded too. So that can play into it as well. But with vitamins, the multivitamin that I have been offering for a long time is Repashy Calcium Plus. I would offer that to Neville the same week that I'm offering calcium. I would just add the multivitamin in every other week. So 1 week I would use the plain calcium carbonate, and then the next week I would use the multivitamin calcium, so that he's getting calcium, D3, and a multivitamin 1 week, and just plain calcium another week, and then it's just a rotational schedule like that. But because I was doing some research about vitamin A, which is in Repashy Calcium Plus, and this probably wouldn't pertain to tiger salamanders as much, but I'm not sure because the research about tiger salamanders and multivitamins isn't as strong as it is for other species, like bearded dragons, for example. But too much vitamin A in the diet isn't great because it's fat soluble, which means it can be an overdosing problem, because if it was water soluble, they would pass it through their body, but it's not. It's fat soluble. So I think it's Repcal, I'm not sure, but Herptivite is what it's called, and it has beta carotene instead of vitamin A, which allows the amphibian or reptile to make their own vitamin A. When they eat the beta carotene, it becomes vitamin A in their body instead of just being straight vitamin A, and they're able to process it out if needed because it comes as beta carotene. I am new to trying Herptivite. I've used Repashy Calcium Plus for years without any problems, so it's probably completely safe to use, and I would recommend it because I've been using it without problem. However, I'm open to change and learning new things, so I want to give the other supplement a try. That said, you are going to want to have on hand for your tiger salamander calcium carbonate, which is calcium without D3, and or calcium plus D3. And then you're going to want to have a separate multivitamin, or the Repashy Calcium Plus, which is calcium, a D3, and a multivitamin. Again, this can be a bit complicated. You probably won't mess it up when it comes to a tiger salamander because they're not as sensitive about needing calcium and vitamins as a reptile is, because their husbandry is quite different. But just keep that in mind. Keep all of what I mentioned in mind when you are shopping for your supplements. The best way to get the powder on the insects is to put the powder in a bowl and just like whisk it around. Dubia roaches in particular hold that powder really well. Mealworms, superworms tend to not hold it as well. And as for crickets, I can't say because I loathe crickets with every fiber of my being, so I don't keep them in the house. But dubia roaches hold calcium really well. So just either put them in a bowl and shake them around, or put them in a bag and shake them around. As long as you're getting an insect that is lightly coated in the calcium and whatever other supplement you're using, it could be calcium with D3. As long as they are coated in the supplement lightly, then you're good to go. So now let's talk about the well-being of your tiger salamander, and first we're going to talk about shedding. So as I had mentioned earlier, Neville did shed yesterday, and she shed in her water area and left this gelatinous floating skin mass in the surface of the water. So tiger salamanders will shed their skin, and they'll shed more often if they're eating more often and less often if they're not, or if they're growing, for example, they'll shed more because they're eating more and they're growing. So when they shed, they kind of just like slip out of it like it's a night dress, or just like and slip out of it, and it's gross looking but also really cool looking. It's like this really thin, rubbery, see-through skin, and it has little feet and hands and everything, like it's their full body, and there's like little black toe tips. Oh, it's delightfully weird. But a lot of times they'll eat this. So Neville, if she sheds out of her water, it will like roll up into like this little, I don't know honestly, but it'll roll off her body into like this little roll, and you can see like how it's been rolled up because it's just gone down her body. And then when it's finally off her tail, sometimes she'll turn around and eat it. Sometimes she leaves it there, sometimes she eats it. Typically when an animal eats their shed, it is to get the nutrients out of it or to hide it from predators. So if a predator were to come across like a shed of an animal they want to eat, they'll be like, I know one of these lives around here, and then that could endanger the tiger salamander's life. So yeah, it's for protection and for nutrients. It's weird, but it's cool at the same time. I don't always see Neville shed because sometimes she eats it, but I would say she sheds like once every couple weeks. It should all come off in one piece. Sometimes it breaks in half, but it should all come off in one solid slimy piece. But if it looks flaky or dry, or if it's breaking apart, or if they don't shed all the way, this could be indicative of an underlying health problem, and you should seek out the advice of your exotic vet. Now let's talk about poop. So tiger salamander's poop looks like a little brown sausage, like it's a little, it's like a little poop oval, and if I have a picture I'll include it, but I'm really not sure if I have one. But it's a little poop sausage. Sometimes they'll poop in the substrate and sometimes they'll poop in the water. Typically Neville poops in her water. It's like a little brown sausage, and it should just be one uniform shape, and it shouldn't be falling apart unless it's been sitting in water for a long time. If you see any like weird coloration in it, or if they're not pooping, which can be hard to tell because they might poop on their substrate. Just in general, if something seems off about their poop, contact your exotic vet. So now let's talk about what they look like in terms of size and weight, and what's a healthy size and weight. So like I mentioned, they can be anywhere between like 8 and 14 inches, which is kind of a large reach or a large span. And the same can be said for their weight. If they're smaller, their weight's going to be smaller. If they're bigger, their weight's going to be bigger. So I'm not going to talk about weight in terms of grams. I'm going to talk about it in terms of body proportions. So because they have a tendency toward obesity, what you want to avoid is a tiger salamander whose body is a lot wider than the width of their head. You want their head and their body to be really similar. So like the width of their head and then the width of their body can be a little bit larger, but you don't want it to be like gargantuanly larger. People tend to look at overweight animals and be like, oh my god, what a cute chonker. No, it's not cute. Obesity in your animals is not cute. They don't have control over it. They don't realize something is wrong. So I'm not trying to fat shame fat animals, but they can't choose to be obese. Like they don't understand when you're feeding them like table scraps or like really unhealthy food that their obesity is bad. Like they don't realize that. They have no way to change that because what you're doing for them is all that they have. So like what you feed them, that's all they have. The enclosure size, how much enrichment they can get and exercise, that's all they have. So you're in control of the weight of your animal. So if it's too skinny, feed it more. If it's too fat, feed it less. A healthy range is there on purpose. Having an obese animal is just as dangerous as having an underweight animal. Okay, and now we're on to the last part, common health issues. So we're going to talk about different like ailments, and we're also going to talk about different things that you might see that might indicate there is an ailment. be on the lookout for anything on their skin that looks abnormal. A bacterial skin infection is pretty common in tiger salamanders because their skin is so sensitive. It can look like brown or black or even like red or white, like a spot, almost like an ulcer or a scrape. It can also be like a rot, so the skin rots away. So it could be on their feet, and like you might notice a toe or a limb suddenly growing shorter from this. It could be on a part of their body that's causing a sore that's eating away at the tissue. And because tiger salamanders have such great regenerative properties, if you catch it early and you heal it, then oftentimes that will grow back, and it might look a little bit different, but it'll grow back. And so it's always good to be on top of those things and just keep in mind that it'll grow back. So don't be too hard on yourself. If you make a mistake, as long as you take the necessary steps to heal your animal, it will be okay. And also address any husbandry that might have caused this. Like when Neville had a bacterial infection from her Eco-Earth, I took charge of that, healed her, and got rid of the all Eco-Earth substrate and mixed something else with it to offer a more healthy soil. Skin infections can also present themselves as like a general discoloration, or the texture of the skin could be different. If anything looks off, it's a good idea to call your exotic vet. And to also check online forums because people may have had similar issues to you. They can also get fungal infections of the skin or mouth or eyes, and typically when a fungal infection occurs, you'll see like a white cottony growth or like a slimy growth. Another thing you should look out for is bloat in tiger salamanders. Bloat in amphibians is very bad and often is like the last sign that something terrible is happening, and they can die shortly after. Just know that bloating is a bad sign, and if there is bloating occurring, immediately contact your exotic vet. If your tiger salamander is suddenly dropping weight or has not ever really held weight well, it could be an issue of there being a parasite, and so you'll want to take a fecal sample to the vet and see if there's anything going on beneath the surface that you might not know about. Tiger salamanders can also get respiratory infections, which you'll see as this like discharge from the mouth or nose. It can also mean wheezing, and in the event of a respiratory infection, please contact your vet. If there's anything weird going on with your pet, if you notice cloudy eyes, lack of appetite, if you notice weight loss, if you notice anything wrong with their skin, if you notice bloating, if you notice anything that I had mentioned, please contact your exotic vet. The health of your animal is most important, and the best thing you can do is have a good vet to be a resource and an aid if something were to go wrong. And with that, that is everything. 1 hour later. Oh my god, I hope that when I edit this it does not come out to be 1 hour, but if so, that's okay. I hope you learned many things from this, and if you only learned one thing, I mean, at least you still learned something. If you would like to see other tiger salamander videos, whether they be educational or just a bit fun, I will leave a link down in the description down below, and also keep your eyes peeled for a video that I'm about to film right now about 10 reasons why I love tiger salamanders, and pretty much why Neville is the best amphibian in the world. I thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions, comments, or concerns down below. Please consider subscribing and also hitting that notification bell. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!